And with us today is Dr. Inga Zavinsky, who she will introduce herself, who is the Assistant Director of Consumer Care. I'd also like to thank the Helen Fold National Institute of Evidence-Based Practice in Nursing and Healthcare for sharing their wonderful conference room with us today and their wonderful resource, Dr. Zavinsky. So why don't we start with you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much to the ALSN for inviting us to speak. Very excited to talk to you about the role of the hospital-based nurse scientist. I formerly served in that role and absolutely loved it. So I assume all of you that are listening also have an interest in this. Esther Chips has been one of my mentors for many, many years, a fantastic nurse scientist. I can say that about her because I've had the pleasure of working with her. So very excited to have the chance to share with you some of our experiences, and then we're also looking forward to hearing from you. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so our learning objective today, upon completing today's webinar, we're hoping that you can describe the potential roles of the nurse scientist. And who better to start with than Florence Nightingale? It's 2020, the year of the nurse, and as all of you know, she was really our first nurse scientist within our profession. So Brandt described 4 models of nurse scientists in healthcare, and some of you probably are familiar with these. The first model is a nurse scientist that collaborates with academic researchers and to conduct research that's either of an academic interest or a clinical interest. The second type of model is a contracted nurse scientist, where essentially a healthcare organization would contract with an individual to provide nursing research services for a particular organization. The third type of nurse scientist, the model, would be a nurse scientist that's embedded or someone that's employed within an organization. So he or she would be employed and work for the organization and most likely be in charge of the nursing research program within that organization. And lastly, Brandt describes a shared model where the nurse scientist works both for the healthcare organization and a college of nursing. Oftentimes that's a dual appointment, and the person will serve in both capacities. So those are the 4 most common models of nurse scientists in healthcare. So what are the primary roles of a nurse scientist? Well, Brandt and Vesey state that a nurse scientist is really important to shape the culture of inquiry and research for an organization. The nurse scientist needs to encourage nurses to feel that they can ask questions about their practice and really wonder about, is this the best way we're doing things here? What does the evidence state? And the nurse scientist has to create an environment where he or she feels safe to ask these questions. And of course, the nurse scientist mentors others. That's really the primary role of the nurse scientist. Such a fun part of the job to be able to have a chance to interact with nurses and our interprofessional colleagues, but really to mentor them in use of nursing research and use of evidence for practice. Of course, the nurse scientist also conducts research or evidence-based practice projects. And lastly, the nurse scientist can serve as a principal investigator. However, these days in magnet organizations, oftentimes nurses, staff nurses, or clinical nurses serve as the principal investigators within certain organizations. So these are the 4 primary roles of a nurse scientist within a healthcare organization. In addition, there are also some additional roles. For example, to support magnet, that is absolutely the key role of the nurse scientist. Certainly there's the new knowledge section of the magnet document. The nurse scientist is very integral in completing that, ensuring that the healthcare organization meets all those requirements. Many healthcare institutions have a nursing research or evidence-based practice council. Usually the nurse scientist will serve as an advisory role within that. Hopefully that's led by a staff nurse or someone that has served in a clinical capacity. The nurse scientist also provides staff development for research. He or she may provide educational programs like Nursing Research Journal Club or other types of research activities to help nurses learn more about nursing research. A nurse scientist can also serve as adjunct faculty. Oftentimes, the nurse scientist may be teaching at a university setting that's local or online. In addition, the nurse scientist oftentimes serves in an administrator role, often needs to attend various meetings with the chief nursing officer or nursing directors to learn more about what's going on in that healthcare organization. And some nurse scientists also need to find external funding to be able to support their nursing research and to be able to conduct those particular scientific studies. So if it's one thing I'm sure you've learned is that nurse scientists, one size does not fit all. It really depends on the organization's mission and the size. Smaller hospitals may need to share nurse scientist services, either with academic institutions or other clinical institutions. Certainly the role of the nurse scientist also can depend on the patient population that healthcare organization is serving, as well as things like the geographic location. It is important for nurse scientists to consider the strategic plan of the healthcare organization. Ideally, the work of the nurse scientist would support the healthcare strategic plan for that organization, whether that's nursing research or EBP. So this leads us to think about what's the unique contribution of a nurse scientist. Cashin and Pickler describe that the nurse scientist is really in a unique situation to uniquely be able to describe the nursing perspective on the human condition. Of course, we conduct nursing research or any research as a team approach, but the nurse scientist has a unique appreciation of the nursing perspective on the human condition, how nurses view health and illness. Certainly nurses promote prevention and healing because of our holistic approach. And so the nurse scientist really does have a unique contribution when it comes to conducting research in the healthcare setting. Thompson et al. Also describe the nurse scientist as a knowledge broker, someone that connects science and society by building networks. Often that nurse scientist can help connect the staff nurses to other interprofessionals working in the hospital setting. They also can facilitate opportunities among the knowledge producers, i.e. the scientists, and the knowledge users, those that are working in practice. And when they do that, they're able to share the knowledge in an easy to understand manner with those practicing clinically. We can also learn from one another. What the research states and how it's written may be challenging to implement in practice. And that really comes from the expertise of the nurse scientist. As many of you know, there are certain implementation strategies when it comes to implementing research in practice, and the nurse scientist can certainly help facilitate the implementation of those. So what's a typical nurse scientist consult scenario? So in my practice, oftentimes there'd be a staff member or a group of staff members that would identify a clinical problem. And so of course they first go to the literature and they create a PICO question to create an informed question. So they search in multiple databases, and being that they want to be efficient, they look for pre-appraised, high-quality meta-analyses or systematic reviews to answer their question. Now, in so doing, there are really two different scenarios that could follow. So this is really the fork in the road. Is this a research opportunity or is this evidence-based practice? So if you have enough good quality evidence to change practice, it's really EBP. You're going to go down that path and implement best practice. However, if you do not have enough good quality evidence to change practice, then what? So what have you done? You've identified a gap in knowledge and a potential research opportunity. Then what do? Call the nurse scientist. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Esther.
So you've done your literature search and you think you might have a research project to think about. So I had actually been in this role for about 2 years when I had this very excited, fairly novice nurse come to my office, and she looked like she was nearly like blue in the face. And she said, "Dr. Chips, I'm so nervous to talk to you." And really what I realized was it took me back because I didn't think that I was intimidating to staff, but I realized for a staff nurse to come to my office and discuss something, they are really taking a leap of faith. and really stepping out of their traditional staff nurse role. So I thought about it and I thought, you know, how can I encourage people to come and feel really comfortable about that first meeting? So what I would suggest is that you really come prepared. Come prepared to tell me what your passion is and be able to just articulate what you think the clinical problem is. And we'll work through some of the language together. And I tell staff, don't be fearful about language because we can always change language as we move forward. Come having read some of the literature, or if there is none, be able to speak to that. And anything you found data-wise in the literature that supports your problem, highlight that. But I think above and beyond everything is to show your passion. So we are going to go on a mission together, and it's never a short journey. I will start off by telling you that. And I always tell staff, whatever you plan or whatever you think this project might take, double it, and we're probably okay. So here are the things that you want to pack in your toolkit to support this journey. The first thing is you want to look at your organization's strategic plan, and you might say, well, why is that really important? I think the strategic plan helps you identify what the mission of the organization is. And most chief nurses that I've interacted with and worked with, they want to know that research efforts are aligning with the organization's strategic plan. Secondly, we want to make sure that you have support from your administrators, your senior leaders, and any key stakeholders, whether that be the physicians or your IT colleagues or your PT colleagues. And then before we move even further, we need to have a really good understanding of the organization's policy, procedures, and research, policies and procedures regarding research and EBP. And I've had the opportunity to talk with colleagues around the country who work in different types of organizations, and you'll find that there's a great deal of variability. For example, in some organizations, a staff nurse cannot serve as a principal investigator, and there are very strict rules about that. And in others, that's not the case. In our organization, we actually have a policy where we are able to get a waiver for people who meet specific criteria. But by and large, without that waiver, which is what the nurse scientist in my role, what I execute, staff nurses cannot be principal investigators. Okay, as we go on to our second meeting, okay, we're going to start digging deeper, and we're going to really summarize the state of the science. So following your literature review, the state of the science is really about a 2 to 3 paragraph summary of where we are in the world of this particular clinical problem. It should be short and sweet and to the point. And we also want to know whether the problem is at the unit level, the hospital level, the national level, or the universe, for example. The other thing we want to have a great sense of is what's the appetite for the problem, if you will, and are you going to get buy-in from your staff colleagues who this might impact? So this is a wonderful equation, and the next thing you want to look at is the feasibility of the study. So this happens a lot where staff are really passionate about a problem, but for whatever reason, it's not feasible to execute. And I know that's always disappointing, and for me, that's very hard to say to staff, but we don't want to move forward with something that is going to take us 9 months, 12 months to plan to find out that it's not a feasible problem to study. So sometimes the way to think about this is the significance of the problem over the cost of conducting the study. And the cost isn't necessarily just money. It can be other resources, people's time, accessibility to technology, accessibility to equipment. So there are multiple things that they're like, you have to add them up. It really should be cost of personnel plus staff time plus, any technology plus any equipment. And those are just a few things. So in the big feasibility picture, so the thing you want to look at is time. So if you're a staff nurse or a CNS, can you get some time off of your unit or your allotted time for a particular project to dedicate to this project? If not, that can be a real limitation. Budget, okay, are you going to apply for some external funding? And if not, is there monies that can be used that the organization has in their budget to support maybe a small pilot project? Look at your nurse scientist should help you look at the infrastructure. Is there a statistician who is available to support this project? Usually at least 1 or 2 statistical consults are needed. And is there a cost associated with that statistician? Statisticians, by the way, have gotten really expensive. And I would say the cheaper end is about $150 an hour. And I've seen some who charge up to $250 an hour. So you want to get that quote as early as possible so you can plan. And then a lot of organizations, particularly if you're associated with the university, have an office of research. And sometimes they have some support mechanisms in place. For example, at OSU, they will help you package your external grant. The other thing, and perhaps the thing that I think is the most important, is what is your commitment on this journey? Because again, you are committing somewhere between a year and more likely up to 2 years. And do you have the wherewithal, the stamina? Are you going to stay in this position? What are your long-term goals? So all of those things should be considered when you think about feasibility. Again, other considerations are alignment with the organization's standard of care and policy. So if you're going to be doing a research project or you're proposing a research project that already has a policy, you want to be keenly aware of what's said in that policy and what your study might be proposing that might deviate from that policy. Who are your patients? And in the case of a study would be who are your proposed subjects? The timeline for your study. What else is going on in the organization? Are there other major strategic initiatives that are going to be initiated around the same time that you're planning a study? For example, we were doing a survey for our nursing satisfaction for Magnet. And we also had at that time, we were planning on doing a research survey on another topic related to nursing that didn't have to do with satisfaction. So it wasn't a wise idea for us to align those two around the same time. So we pushed back our research survey because we needed to get our nursing satisfaction survey done first to make our Magnet deadlines. The other thing that happens inevitably, what are the competing clinical projects? And if there is, something else going on in that unit or that division, is it possible to move it someplace else? Or can you talk with your colleagues about their time plan implementation and see what that's going to look like and how that might compete? It is not unusual. I had a situation where I was doing a study in the ICU on oral care, and there were a group of physicians that were doing a study, and we actually had the same enrollment criteria. So we had to work out something so that we wouldn't be competing for the same patients. The other thing to think about is if you're doing this on a nursing clinical unit, especially in the inpatient acute care setting, how might this impact on nursing workflow and nursing time? Of course, we all know that that's precious time, I might add. And we want to make sure that we are not inconveniencing our staff nurse colleagues with this study. Clearly, if we do that, we will have less buy-in. What are the equipment needs? And then lastly, it's great to do a study, but we want to make sure that we can disseminate it, implement it, and I would underline sustained practice changes. So we've done our feasibility, and so are we ready to go? Well, I say yes. Okay. So let's put our team together. As I mentioned, who will be the principal investigator? That is going to vary. The principal investigator in some cases may be your PhD prepared nurse scientist, but her role here is going to be the mentorship role. But she may be the principal investigator for the purposes of the Institutional Review Board or the Office of Research. You want to put together your team. You should have, I highly recommend that you have nurse champions. And be sure that you review the IRB requirement for staff nurse participation. That may vary. When you include staff nurses, be sure about what their role is going to be. Are they going to help with recruitment, data collection, or something else? Oftentimes I have interdisciplinary team members. I've worked with a lot of people from IT and from human factors. And I also often have academic partners. I may have another nurse scientist on the team from the College of Nursing who may have some expertise that I do not have. Okay, now we're going to sit down and we are going to write the proposal. For novice researchers, I often say we're going to divide and conquer, and I use the word chunk this out quite a bit. So we might start with writing the problem statement and the background and the significance, and we're going to get that so we feel really comfortable and really good about that, and then we might move on to do the methods section, et cetera, et cetera. Some people prefer to have a single author. Other people prefer to write with multiple authors. That's a preference. I've done both. I'm open to both. I'm not sure that one is better than the other. The goal is at the end, you have a very tight, well-written, clear document. And I will say this is going to take multiple iterations. It goes on. For those of you who are novice, I mean, we will send back changes for a sentence, or we can make the sentence shorter and more clear. I mean, we are really counting words here. In fact, a word count on the Word program is a great friend of ours, because many times if you're writing for external grants, they have very limited word count. So you get really good at editing. The other thing that is exceedingly important, and I am a bulldog about this, is you want to keep firm deadlines. If you're working as a group, there's nothing more disappointing than when people are kind of lag behind. Again, there's a hard date, particularly if you're sending out for an external review. So you want to have everything ready to go. I always recommend that you upload things the day before, because just like your mom said, come to the interview early. You never know what can happen. So for example, I was planning on being here today at 11 o'clock, and guess what? My battery in my car died. And fortunately, since I gave myself some lead time, I actually made it in time. But the same thing applies for doing this type of academic work. Don't leave it to the last minute. So you have your research proposal completed. So some things that I always recommend is you send it out for a feasibility review. Some organizations have a said way of doing it. They may have their research council do it, or they have somebody else in the organization who's skilled at this doing a feasibility review. But that again tells you, is this really doable in our organization? Plus, you want as much, the more feedback you get, the better your proposal is. And that goes for any kind of academic work, whether it be a research proposal or the manuscript that you're going to disseminate. So let's move on and talk about the institutional review, IRB, often labeled the IRB. Some people see this word and they shake in their boots. I want to be really clear about this. The IRB is there to protect you and your subjects. The IRB should be viewed as your friends and colleagues. They are there, although they can be tough, and they have a high bar because, again, their job is to protect the rights of our subjects and make sure that research is safe. But get to know your IRB, call the administrators on the IRB. Oftentimes there might be, like at our IRB at OSU, which is huge because we're such a huge organization, but we have probably 10 or 15, and they all have different roles. So if you're doing something would go to the biomedical, talk to those folks, get to know them. They're there to help you troubleshoot. And then you have to determine there are different types of IRB reviews. One might be exempt, one might be expedited, one might be full. We don't have time, unfortunately, to get into the details of those, but most, I would say probably 95% of nursing studies go expedited. I've only had one that has gone to a full review. The other thing is, be aware of IRB timelines. They vary from institution. At our institution, we do not expect to hear back for at least 8 weeks. So remember, you cannot do anything until you have IRB approval. So make sure that as you put your timeline in your study, that you know what the turnaround time for your IRB is. Again, you cannot move forward with your study until you have that IRB approval in your hand. The other thing I want to remind people of, and again, even subtle changes, like a change in the recruitment flyer, which may be only a few words, any change that you make in your proposal, your recruitment materials, your survey, any minor change must go back to the IRB for reapproval, and that's called an amendment. So again, those can take 2 to 3 weeks. This is why sometimes it takes us longer, because we find out, you know what? There's something not right about the survey and we've got to go back and fix it. I can tell you, I have never done a research study where I haven't had to make a small change and an amendment. Okay, the next role. So you finished your study and your results are wonderful, or maybe your results aren't so good and they're disappointing. Even if they're disappointing, you still want to disseminate your findings. So then it's time to make a list, make a written list of the places that you want to do a podium or a poster presentation. And then you also want to begin preparing your manuscript. And that's another 6 months, perhaps a year journey. Okay, so that takes us, it's now 12:30, my goodness. I'm glad to answer any questions. Dr. Zavinskas and us can hang on here. Do we know how to get to the chat box? Questions? They're singing it high. We do on occasion have fun.
Questions?
I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So our participants cannot speak. I can unmute them if you would like.
Sure. We have a few
Otherwise,
minutes to answer any questions.
all right, I'm opening up to allow them to speak.
Yeah, I assume we're unmuted now. Thank you, Dr. Cherry. How do you get time commitments since nurses seem so overloaded with patient care? That's probably, to be honest with you, the biggest challenge. And so we negotiate that with the nurse manager or the director, depending on who it is. I have one nurse, staff nurse that I'm working with in our heart hospital who has actually invented a new dressing for catheter lines, and she is moving forward with an FDA application. And so this woman is working at home, which is not necessarily what we encourage, but she's so fired up about getting this. She's got a patent on it, so she's fired up. Oh, thank you, Dr. Laura.
Dr. Cherry, as far as the time commitment, I agree that's always been a challenge. If you can, if there are any of the staff nurses that are going back to school, sometimes that's a nice way to be able to have that individual nurse meet school requirements as well as help the organization. I think one strategy to help get the time commitment, potentially support time from the nurse manager, would again be to go back to that strategic plan. If the topic of the nursing research is directly related to the strategic plan, the staff nurse may be more likely perhaps to get some paid time to be able to conduct the research, whether that's chart reviews or writing the proposal or meeting with the scientist. But that's one strategy that I found it's really important to go back to that strategic plan.
Can you guys hear me? Can I ask another question? This is Barbara Cherry.
Sure.
Yes.
So how do you start in the beginning? You know, I know because I'm in academics and we teach our students, you know, you need to look for situations that might be a research opportunity, questions you have about practice. But how do you, I mean, I think they hear that and it goes, you know, straight through their brain because they're so concerned about the real care of the patient. So how do you, from the beginning, get nurses to start, even staff nurses, frontline staff nurses to start in that mindset of how do I think about research questions that we need to be working on, that I'm interested in and passionate about? Do you do any pre-work with these nurses?
You know, that's a great question, Barbara. Oftentimes, usually they're having conversations with fellow staff nurses, and there's kind of like you can't say, I'm actually moving my hands, but you know, they're going, what do you think about this? And what do you think about this? And then we are very fortunate at OSU, we happen to have clinical nurse specialists. But sometimes they'll engage the clinical nurse specialist and then she'll say, oh, you need to go see Esther Chebs. Go talk with Esther. A lot of this, I will tell you, is based on trust and comfort level. You know, it took me several years to feel that the staff knew who I was, understood what my role was, got comfortable. Also, we have a really active EBP and research shared governance council. So a lot of our staff nurses who are interested in research will try and get on those councils. So they're kind of like our energizing bunnies as well.
Okay.
And I see a question from Laura Carmonica. How do you cultivate a relationship with the holders of all data sources so to assist nurses to get the data they need? Oh, that is, I would love for ALSN to invite me back to give a whole webinar on just that question. That has gotten so complicated because of the increasing concerns about HIPAA. And increasingly complicated because more and more nurses are getting engaged with data science. And so I have personal relationships with the administrators in our information warehouse, so I know who to go to and ask, but it is a very complicated process. And there are many, many layers of approval that one needs to go to ensure that the data is de-identified, because there are major risks.
Laura, one strategy that we use, we were interested in conducting a research study about patient falls. So I invited the NDNQI expert, the nursing database and nursing quality indicators. She was interested in the topic. She became a member of our research team. She had access to all that data. And by all means, and she was certainly an expert. I am not an NDNQI expert. She was very familiar with all the measurement and the definitions and who collected what at each hospital. This was a system level study. So that's another strategy as far as cultivating, inviting them. And she was integral, really asked some terrific questions for that particular study.
The other thing I would say for those of you who are online who are faculty for DNP students, when your DNP students go out to their hospital where they may be implementing their project, I also ask my students, because again, I also serve on the faculty side, so I actually have DNP students. If they're doing projects outside of my own institution, OSU, I have them bring me a letter of support from the individual from whom they are getting the data, because the organization needs to know that the data is being released for the purposes of a student project. And I myself as an advisor need to be assured of that. I see there's another question. Do your council members conduct research or EBP projects? That's a good question. Actually, last year, and Inga, who is also an EBP expert, I'm not an EBP expert, but Inga helped our research council. We actually did a full EBP council, the whole EBP project, the whole council did on CAUTIs, and then we used that project to update our policy. And it was a very successful experience. Thank you for the question.
In my experience, when it comes to the EBP council, usually the council members, we conduct evidence-based practice projects. Certainly the role of the nurse scientist can assist with research, but in my experience, that oftentimes the members of that council don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge about research methods. Certainly can provide the background and can certainly help with the literature search, but as far as really reviewing a research proposal for scientific integrity, that may not be a skill set. However, very valuable for other reasons. And sometimes what happens is we'll go to look at the literature and we'll find a gap. And then at that point, you offer that staff nurse, would you like to pursue this? Are you interested? Sometimes it's a yes, sometimes it's a no. But oftentimes what I've discovered is that the most interesting nursing research topics come from the staff nurses. They ask a really good question, something I would have never thought of. But so that part's really fun. As far as a nurse scientist, people will ask, well, what do you study? You study whatever the nurses are interested in. So I'm always fascinated. You learn so much from them because I'm not at the bedside anymore. So it's really such a fantastic role to be able to serve in that capacity. So, and then Laura also made me think of, you're saying how to start to initiate conversations about nursing research topics. I think it's helpful to say, what are the crazy makers? What is driving you nuts in practice with why do we do something the way we do it? And either you might end up with a really good evidence-based practice project. Well, there is evidence out there and we should be doing X and we're doing Y based on tradition. Or you identify a gap that ends up being a great opportunity for nursing research. So I think that's one way to stimulate interest about practice. Ask the nurses about what's going on. If you observed anything that seems unfounded, or you're not sure, why do we do that? Or maybe a nursing student asks, someone's doing clinicals on the unit and they ask, why do you guys do that? If we don't know the answer, that's a good question. We should be looking into it. Is there evidence out there for that? Or did they identify something that we don't know? So that's another way to stimulate interest. I've heard some nursing units will develop a box where people put in ideas. If they're not comfortable coming to someone personally, they'll have like a box where they put in ideas, things that are bothering them, and then you could potentially pull those as EBP projects or nursing research ideas. So that's another way to generate interest among staff nurses in nursing research?
The other thing is, in this role, what I've learned, and it's hard, is not to be afraid to fail sometimes. And it does happen. And when I say fail, I'll give you a couple examples. One is the data isn't what you thought it was going to be. Okay, and that happens quite frequently. And at first, when I began this life as a nurse scientist, if the data wasn't good, I was like devastated. Oh my God, we have no findings. But the reality is no findings are important. And part of the problem is we don't always publish our negative findings. So I encourage people, this may not be what you thought it was going to be, but we need to get it out there. That's number one. The other, and I have a specific example in mind, is you have a great idea, but it really isn't, it turns out not to be feasible. And the example I'm going to share was a couple of years ago. The OR nurses came to me, and this was the OR nurses that do spinal surgery with the neurosurgeons and the orthopedic surgeons. And they were concerned about, these are long cases, and of course they're concerned about positioning and the cubitus ulcers, post-surgery. And so they said, we want to know what the best position is if we have to leave patients. Oh, the other thing was, I just remembered, they were using robotics. And when you do robotic procedures, the patients are actually locked on the table. I kind of, when I went in and looked at it, I thought if patients really knew what this looked like, they wouldn't sign up to do it. And they're locked on the table, okay? So you can't even get underneath them to shimmy them if you want. So their concern was really, really very legitimate, and there was nothing in the literature. So we thought about it and thought about it. And I talked to some physical therapists, and there was actually a machine where you could map, it's pressure mapping, and they use that actually to fit people for wheelchairs. So they could see when you sit on a wheelchair how much pressure is on the seat. So we started playing with that with the physical therapist, and we thought, wouldn't this be great if we could put it underneath the OR table? And we could then look at the pressure the patient was experiencing. Everybody was really excited about that. And we tried it a few times. Here was the problem and why it wasn't feasible. For those of you who've ever had any OR experience, you know that there's a very tight schedule that the surgeons work on, and setting this equipment up was going to take about 45 minutes to do. And we didn't get support from the OR committee to inject another 45 minutes in their schedule, which is incredibly costly because they run the OR just like, literally like a factory. I hate to say it, but they clock in at 12:45, they start the case at 12:45, the room is booked for 2 hours, and that room has to be cleared out in 2 hours. So adding another 45 minutes to do this was just not feasible.
Other questions?
Not seeing any more questions roll in. I just want to let everybody know that you should be receiving an email later today with your survey evaluation. Once we get that completed, a certificate will be emailed to you.
And I was thinking about what Esther said. I really appreciate the idea of the importance of all scientists publishing non-statistically significant findings, because oftentimes when we're trying to look at evidence for practice, it's so frustrating to potentially try to implement something and replicate something and then realize what a waste it was, didn't work. And if only someone had published that, you wouldn't be repeating the same intervention. That's just completely futile, waste of money and time and resources. So I do think that that's changing, with editors are becoming more receptive to that, but it used to be, only if it was statistically significant. But oftentimes, clinically, when we're conducting studies, it's really challenging to get large sample sizes. So really these days we're trying to look at effect sizes and not necessarily statistical significance, but really clinical significance.
I don't know, yeah. Well, let me give you our emails. I'm Chips, CHIPPS, and I'll give you my .1@osu.edu. So that's chips.1@osu.edu.
And mine is Zadvinskas, which is spelled Z as in zebra, A, D as in David, V as in Victor, I-N as in Nancy, skis.1@osu.edu. We are happy to answer any questions via email. Sometimes questions come up after the fact.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you both for your time today and all who have attended. Like I stated before, you will be receiving an evaluation to fill out, and once that's completed, we will be sending your certificate.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you all today.
All right.
Thank you.
And I hope the sun is shining someplace in the US.